There's a raging debate in South Africa that is impacting the South African economy, investor confidence, and threatening to undermine and compromise the Constitution about the distribution of, people think, land, but in fact it's all forms of property, everything anyone owns, houses, businesses, shops, companies, shares, pension schemes and other forms of investment and asset. And the question really is whether these should be expropriated by the government without compensation. Now the debate takes place on an assumption that there has been too little redistribution racially from predominantly white owners of property to black owners of property. And this assumption is made without any empirical basis whatsoever. The only evidence that is ever trotted out is various land audits, so-called, and these audits base their estimates on area, the area of land. Now, you don't even have to read any of these audits. There's some what I would call right and left-wing audits, because they are based on an assumption that what matters is area. That presupposes that the value of an acre, for example, in the middle of the Kalahari Desert or the middle of the Karoo, is the same as the value of an acre where I am now, which is Sandton, probably the most valuable land in the country, or Bryanston or Constantia or the Kruger National Park or somewhere, that all land has the same value. It clearly doesn't. And so any estimate or any discussion or any debate about what percentage of the land is owned, supposedly owned, by a particular race or gender or by the government or the private sector is completely and utterly meaningless and should be literally thrown into the rubbish bin without even bothering to open, because of how utterly and completely irrelevant it is. What matters, if you're talking about the distribution of land, is value. Nobody has the slightest idea what the ratio is of the value of land occupied or owned by business, by government, by private individuals, by whites or blacks, or men or women. So since we don't even know where we're departing from, we can't embark on a journey, and we don't even know where we want to end up. In other words, the debate takes place as if there is already enough transformation or not enough transformation. Nobody has the slightest idea how much there has been, and nobody ever knows what the objective is. Where does anyone want to end up? Nobody has the foggiest idea. And so not only is it by area completely irrelevant, and therefore all the money and time spent debating the land audits, complete waste of time, the left-wingers or the socialists tend to say, or the racists on one side tend to say that too much is owned by white people, and all sorts of silly numbers get floated around. 80% of the land, quote unquote, is complete nonsense and twaddle, even if it were correct by area, which it isn't, is owned, for example, by white people. But whatever it is, and then you get the right wing or the racists on the other side come along and say, the other racists come along and say, no, actually much less is owned by white individuals than is normally realized, and the estimates put it at below 20%, in other words, less than is owned by the government. So we have these two opposite estimates, but regardless of debating them, you don't need to. It's a completely pointless exercise because they all presuppose area. What might have some relevance is value, and in that case you have a different debate entirely, for which we have no evidence, no debate, no targets, no concerns about what's wrong supposedly with the existing distribution. Or you could have another reasonable calculus, which is by the number, the quantity. How many pieces of land, how many parcels of land, whether registered in the deeds registry or not, or allocated by permissions to occupy, quitrents, deeds of grant, and all sorts of other forms of tenure and title, 99-year leases and so on. If it's by number, then the overwhelming number are already in the hands of black South Africans. If it's by value, nobody knows, except that we do know this, that by value, all of the land of the highest value is in the name of companies and belongs to companies, or the government, or state-owned enterprises. So that if it's by value, then the redistribution to government, or the nationalization by government, would be an entirely pointless exercise. Nobody knows or has classified racially the companies. So we wouldn't know what the ratios there are. Even most of the land by area is actually owned by companies. Very little of it is owned by individuals, white or black, and therefore the entire discourse takes place on a meaningless set of assumptions without any stated goals, without any knowledge of what we start with, and therefore we need to go right back to the drawing boards and say, what matters? What do we want to measure? How would we measure or estimate it? And how would we like it to be when there has been sufficient transformation? The entire current discourse of amending the Constitution should be abandoned as based on meaningless assumptions, on a meaningless set of debates and a meaningless bunch of rhetoric. Go back to the drawing board, work out what we have now, what the status quo is, and then have a debate about what we want the end result to be, and then set about formulating policies, whether or not those would involve amending the Constitution.